Welcome back. All right, so we are up to the 1964-1965 season. We are 2 years away from seeing some expansion. But that being said, Detroit returns to the top of the league for the first time in almost a decade. They finished with 87 points, a record of 40, 23, and 7. They are captained by Alex Delvecchio. 224 goals scored, 175 goals against. The scoring seems to be coming down again in the NHL. Again, these things are cyclical. Montreal finishes 4 points behind Detroit, so 83 points for them, a record of 36, 23, and 11 overall. 211 goals scored, 185 goals against. Chicago's third in the league, 34, 28, and 8 record. Jean Beliveau's the captain of Montreal. I don't think I mentioned that. 76 points for Chicago that year. Pierre Pilote being their captain. 224 goals scored, 176 goals against. So almost the exact same goals for and against as Detroit. The Toronto Maple Leafs finish fourth, 74 points for them. They're captained by George Armstrong. 30, 26, and 14 record, 204 goals scored, 173 goals against. So by virtue of them allowing the fewest goals, their goaltenders share the Vezina Trophy, which is a first, and we'll get there. The New York Rangers missed the playoffs by a mile, 52 points. So they missed the playoffs by 22 points. They finished 20, 38, and 12. They are captained by Bob Nevin, scoring 179 goals and allowing 246. But as rough as that record is, it's not Boston rough. Boston finishes 21, 43, and 6. 48 points. They are captained by Leo Boivin. 166 goals scored, 253 goals against. So again, Boston, pretty miserable time for the Bruins, but at least they've stopped losing to Montreal in the playoffs. So Ted Lindsay returns to the Detroit Red Wings after having retired 4 years earlier, and he helps them. They end up getting back to first. Punch Imlach tries Tim Horton on the wing as the Leafs are struggling. Despite great goaltending, the Leafs are having their struggle putting the puck in the net. As you can see, they had the least amount of goals of all the teams that made the playoffs. And so, yeah, rough time for them. In fact, Frank Mahovlich, Peter's of another time, Frank Mahovlich is feuding with Punch Imlach and feeling a lot of pressure from Toronto Maple Leaf fans to the point where he ends up in the hospital for stress and trying to deal with that. So it's not a great time for Mahovlich. And Punch Imlach, I mean, the Stanley Cups are great and everything, but eventually he kind of becomes a villain in Toronto's history. Then June 10th of 1964, the Leafs take Terry Sawchuk from the Wings and Dickie Moore from the Habs in the intra-league draft. It's similar to waivers. It's very similar to waivers. You can protect a certain amount of players, and the Leafs get Terry Sawchuk and Dickie Moore, which helps. I mean, it definitely helps the goaltending. Dickie Moore, though, not as effective in Toronto as he had been years before that in Montreal. June 28th, 1964, the Habs acquire the rights to Ken Dryden from the Boston Bruins. So, not Boston's greatest moment there. But yeah, Ken Dryden would end up being the next one for Montreal. Montreal's had one great goalie after another throughout their history. November 21st of 1964, Terry Sawchuk shuts out the Chicago Blackhawks 1-0. It's the 16th straight season that Sawchuk records a shutout. That is an NHL record. And not a surprise, Sawchuk with a shutout record. March 20th of 1965, Pierre Pilote of the Chicago Blackhawks records the 58th point of that season, which sets a record for NHL defensemen. March 23rd of 1965, Stan Mikita records his 59th assist, which is now an NHL record. He would finish the season with those 59 assists. April 11th of 1965, during the playoffs, Norm Ullman scores twice in 5 seconds for the Wings to set an NHL playoff record. Detroit would win that game over Chicago 4-2. January 27th of 1965, Ulf Sterner. So if you ever get asked the question about who was the first European-trained player to play an NHL game, it's Ulf Sterner. He ends up playing 4 National Hockey League games. This is very largely just American and Canadian players, and a vast majority of the players are Canadian in the league at this point. February 4th of 1965, Terry Sawchuk becomes the first goalie to win 400 games in his NHL career. Of course, Sawchuk, we know, ends up very high on the all-time list. He's still very high on the all-time list. remarkable considering it was a shorter schedule that he played, but he did play a lot of those games, so I guess it kind of balances out. March 11th of 1965, the NHL's Board of Governors, with an announcement that if this was announced now, fans would have a meltdown. They announced there's going to be a 6-team expansion, and that those expansion teams will have their own division. So, yeah, the NHL with this idea of going west, there was a lot of interest in, putting teams in the west, in part because there are other leagues trying to eat away at the NHL's market share, so the NHL gets out ahead of things. And of course, we're getting closer to when the World Hockey Association would come into the picture and really make the waters kind of murky. But the 6-team expansion that the NHL does has some mixed results overall. I'm thinking the California Golden Seals is one of the ones that doesn't last that long. But yeah, so we're almost to that stage as the NHL announces, we're going to do some expansion. This is the last season that the NHL goes without a TV deal in the U.S. I think it's 5 in a row they've gone without a TV deal in the U.S. NBC would pick up the deal and broadcast some of the 1966 playoff games, this of course being 64-65. So the Hart Trophy goes to Bobby Hull of the Chicago Blackhawks. The Art Ross goes to Stan Mikita yet again of the Chicago Blackhawks as well. The Calder goes to Roger Crozier of the Detroit Red Wings. The Norris Trophy goes to Pierre Pilote of the Chicago Blackhawks. The Vezina Trophy goes to both Johnny Bower and Terry Sawchuk of the Toronto Maple Leafs. They are the first to share the Vezina Trophy because it's for the lowest goals against average. So it is the Frank Jennings Trophy. Does anybody talk about the Jennings Trophy? Not really, no. And that shows just how weird this is, that the Vezina Trophy then is what the Jennings Trophy is now. We talk a lot about the Vezina wins back then. We almost never talk about Jennings Trophy wins now. The Lady Byng Award goes to Bobby Hull of the Chicago Blackhawks. And the Conn Smythe goes to Jean Beliveau of the Montreal Canadiens. That is the first time the Conn Smythe is awarded, and it goes to Jean Beliveau, an absolute playoff hero. The All-Stars that season, Norm Allman of the Detroit Red Wings is the first team at center. Stan Mikita is the second team All-Star at center. On the right side, Claude Provost of Montreal's first team, and Gordie Howe of the Detroit Red Wings is, of course, the second team All-Star. Bobby Hull is the first line left winger from the Hawks, of course, and Frank Mahovlich of Toronto, despite all of the issues going on with him, he's still second team All-Star. On the blue line, Pierre Pilote of Chicago, of course, first team, alongside Jacques Laperriere of the Montreal Canadiens. Bill Gadsby of the Detroit Red Wings is second team, alongside Carl Brewer of the Toronto Maple Leafs. In net, Roger Crozier of the Detroit Red Wings is the first team All-Star, and Charlie Hodge of the Montreal Canadiens is second team. So, again, Gump Worsley going to Montreal, it was not fantastic for his career because Charlie Hodge ends up being a pretty darn good goaltender. Roger Crozier of the Wings, 40-22-7 record, .913 save percentage with 6 shutouts. Charlie Hodge of Montreal, 26-16-10, .905 save percentage and 3 shutouts. Glenn Hall for Chicago, now that he's not playing every game, 19-16-5 record, .923 save percentage and 4 shutouts. So Hall continues to put up excellent numbers. And Terry Sawchuk in Toronto, 16-13-7 record, .915 save percentage and 1 shutout, as we get into the era where teams are actually using 2 goaltenders. I know, crazy, right? So in the semifinals, almost every series goes to 7 again, but this time Montreal gets this first series done in 6 against Toronto. They win both games at home, 3-2 and 3-1 respectively. Toronto then wins game 3, 3-2 in overtime. Toronto wins the next game to tie the series with a 4-2 win. Montreal wins at home 3-1. Then they go into Toronto. They win in overtime 4-3. They finish that series in 6. The other semifinal, of course, sees Detroit and Chicago go at it. Detroit wins the first 2 games at home. Looks like they're going to make it a quick, pushing aside sweep, as it were, of the Chicago Blackhawks with 4-3 and 6-3 wins. But Chicago fights back with back-to-back wins at home, 5-2 and 2-1. Detroit wins at home 4-2 to go up 3 games to 2. Chicago, though, not having it. They win at home 4-0 to tie the series. Then they go into Detroit and they win 4-2 to win the series in 7 games and move on to face the Montreal Canadiens in the Stanley Cup final. In that final, Montreal goes up 2-0 with wins of 3-2 and 2-0 respectively. However, Chicago does the exact same thing they did in the last series. They win both games at home to tie the series. 3-1 and 5-1 respectively. Montreal then wins 6-0 to go up 3-2 in the series. Chicago wins at home 2-1, and then Montreal wins 4-0. So a lot of shutouts in that Stanley Cup final. 3 of them by Montreal. Montreal wins the series in 7 games, and the home team wins all 7 games. Bobby Hull, 14 games in those playoffs, 10 goals, 7 assists for 17 points. Jean Beliveau, 13 games, 8 goals, 8 assists, 16 points. And Bobby Rousseau, also of the Montreal Canadiens, 13 games, 5 goals, 8 assists, 13 points. Montreal uses both goalies in the playoffs. Gump Worsley, 1.68 goals against average. So when he gets that chance, he shows he's still elite. Charlie Hodge, a 2.00 goals against. And Glenn Hall had a 2.21 goals against average in those playoffs. So, interesting result. Montreal's back on top. How long will they stay on top? Well, we'll discuss that again later on in the 65-66 video. So stay tuned for that. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you've not done so already. Thank you guys so much for all your support as always. I will talk to you again soon.